I'm going to put in the flash sync setting lever, self-timer setting lever, that can go in now. So I'll put a smear of molybdenum paste on that little ratchet gear there, a little bit on the spring. There's a detent there. It's not uncommon for these levers to be bent. If there's a problem with the shutter, people often get stuck in and start pushing and prodding on everything that they can see. The setting lever for the self-timer is very commonly bent. That one shows some slight distortion. See if I can pull that back square. That's good. This lever needs to go on. The pin on the lever needs to go between the spring here and that part of the case. So that's sitting nicely, that's good. Didn't even give me any grief. This shim goes in here. It only goes around one way, and that's not the way. There's a little tongue on it, so it only locks in one position. Just close that diaphragm very slightly and put the diaphragm setting lever in place. There's a little hole on the diaphragm setting lever that picks up that pin. There are 3 screws that hold this setting lever in place. That's good. I'll check that the aperture setting lever moves smoothly. It does. If there's any hint of stiffness at this point, as long as the diaphragm had otherwise been very smooth after you'd cleaned that, normally I would just drop a little bit of graphite powder in under these 3 screw heads and work it backwards and forwards, and typically that makes it, fixes any stiffness there if there's any roughness to it. That part's done. The flash sync stuff really needs to go in now, so the palette wheel first. And then the sector gear that runs against the palette wheel. Now normally I lubricate the tail of this with a touch of molybdenum paste. Drop that into position. Hold back that pin so I can get that seated correctly. That's better. And there's a spring for this, which needs this spring, which can be tricky to install. Just removing a thread of cotton there. So I normally grasp this with a pair of needle nose pliers, hook it over at this end, stretch it out and drop it into that hole on the top of that lever. So if that's cocked, and if I move the blade actuating ring, you'll see that the pallets ran down. So that's all good, that's done. Start assembling the flash contact stuff. This lever fits in here. It's got this big curved spring on it. Make sure that goes against the case and isn't sticking up in the air or tucked down or in some funny other position. The flash contact goes here on top of that lever. Normally I set this action by pulling this towards the back till it latches. Put this lever in position. Single screw at this end. A return spring at this end and a shoulder screw to hold the spring and the plate in position. Check that the spring is free to rotate around that screw. In other words, that the spring is not trapped underneath the screw head. And then hook the spring into position behind this lever. So lift it up over the top, swing it round behind, and there's a little notch in the back of that lever that the spring sits in. And you can see there that that lever is spring loaded. I've got the shutter release lever here, and I just put a very sparing smear of molybdenum paste on the shaft of that. And I've got to tuck in its return spring with the tip of a screwdriver as I put that in place. Check that the B action works well. That dropped in and locked the shutter open. As the shutter release is lifted back up, it allows the shutter to close. It's very stiff in action. It doesn't drop in easily at the end of the action. One thing to watch is the flash contact. If the flash contact pushes up too hard against the moving flash contact pushes up too hard against the fixed contact, it requires too much effort at the end of the stroke for the shutter to complete its action, and that appears to be what's happening there. So I'm just going to bend that flash contact away slightly. We want it to just contact. That's better. A little bit more contact than that though. We want it to just contact as the blades reach full open. Without making the shutter action stiff. Normally you don't have to adjust that. Normally that would be pretty good. Getting electronic flashes used to be very easy to ignite in the old days. You needed hardly any contact at all because the trigger voltage was very, very high, hundreds of volts in some cases. And that would mean that even with a dirty contact, it was going to make and fire your flash without any problems. Modern electronic flashes often have a very low voltage, trigger voltage, because otherwise they tend to fry the electronics of modern cameras. And so a modern flash may well not work on an old camera with grubby flash contacts, whereas an old electronic flash may have no problems at all. Bulb flash, of course, was another issue again, because bulbs very often were quite a low voltage. The bulb, the circuitry for those was often at very low voltage. Again, that would be affected by dirty contacts. I'm just putting the main drive spring in position. I haven't replaced it in this case. I decided that it was no worse than the other examples that I had, or that the other examples I had were no better than this one. It'll work fine in a freshly cleaned shutter, and you can see, probably hear that shutter fires quite well. Now I want to put my retard gear train in place, so I cock the shutter, put the retard gear train in position, pull back this tab at the end of it so that the lever at the bottom is behind a raised section on the blade actuating ring, not sitting on top of it. That's good. There's one screw at this end. The position of the retard gear train is adjustable. It can be swung inwards for greater engagement or outwards for less engagement. Now let's see how this goes. The shutter's cocked. This should take about 1 second to run down. If anything, that sounded a bit quick for 1 second, so I'm going to move the the retard gear train inwards for greater engagement. It sounded a bit more like it. I'm going to fit the delay action or self timer. That's held in with a single screw. First I've got to get this thing seated correctly. That's it. I hold back this tab, the self timer will run down. That's it in the run down position there. The cocking ring. This goes in and I run round the outside edges both inside and out with a bit of molybdenum paste, and there was very little molybdenum paste used there. You need very little of it. You're just not doing much more than putting a dirty mark on there. I'll swing that into position. And here's the cocking gear. The shutter is cocked from behind. No, it's not in this case. This lever cocks the main drive cam and spring at this point. On cameras where the shutter, shaft can extend right through the shutter in some cameras, and that's the point that the shutter is cocked from. Not in this case. So the speed cam, setting cam here, I'm just lubricating the inside edge and round here where the pin on the delay action or self retard gear train run. Swing this in position, make sure the B lever is not trapped underneath it. I'll swing that round to the 1/8 of a second position, and that is fast. So it's running fast. I've got to move this retard gear train in for greater engagement. I'm going to check the self timer. So the shutter's cocked, set to 1/8 of a second. We hit this, the self timer should run down. And the shutter fires. That's good. So I'll cock the shutter, lift off the cocking ring, so I can get at the setting screw here, slacken that screw off, move that retard gear train in slightly for greater engagement, put this all back together again, try it at the 1/8 of a second position. That's still fast. So let me have a look. Alright, we'll just move things in a little bit more. Slacken that screw off. Move that retard gear train. Now the movement required are very slight. Don't be surprised if you overshoot when you're trying to adjust things like that and you have to go back the other way. That's quite normal. You get better with practice. That sounds better. What's a 15th sound like? That sounds fast. But we're pretty close. If you've been doing this for a long time, you get pretty good at judging some speeds. 15th and an 1/8 are easy speeds to judge. That's it. I'll test that on my shutter speed tester, but I would be very surprised if that's not good. Right, that tested up is okay, so I'm going to close up the shutter now. This lever needs to go in. This lever stops the shutter release from being able to be depressed if the shutter's not actually cocked. I've just got to get this in place, getting its return spring behind the post. There it is. That ring can go back on, making sure the B lever's not trapped underneath. That's good. I'll put the retainer ring on the front temporarily. That'll stop the shutter from falling apart. And remember now I need to put this into the outer shutter case. So first I've got that curved pusher. I'm just wiping that with a little bit of molybdenum paste, just enough to put a dirty mark on it really, and the same with the curved rack. They drop into the slot in the outer case. Pusher end first, then the gear. The geared piece obviously goes over the hole that's open because that's where it gets driven, that's where it drives the shutter. Then I fit these in place. Got to get my flash contact in there, and that's not correct at the moment, so I'll pull that back, make sure that's tucked down, slide that round, make sure that flash contact can get into that insulator there. Didn't want to go. That's better, that's done. Line up the screw holes, 3 screws. Normally start with this one, which goes in the middle. And of the 2 countersunk head screws, the thinner shaft one goes over here, the thicker shaft one goes over here. They're both quite small screws, but with practice you can look at the pair of them and you can tell which one's thicker than the other one. As always, don't go mad doing the screws up, otherwise you strip them out, it'll be a problem. We'll do up this screw that holds the flash contact firmly in place. That just has to be snugged up. You don't need to tighten that. You certainly don't need to drive the screw right through the plastic or you won't like the result. Right, so I can still cock the shutter because the lever extends out into that groove. The shutter's all good. Now we're just about ready to close the shutter up. I'm going to remove the cocking ring, the retaining ring. Right, I need to assemble these two parts together. This is the speed setting ring, and I'm just running a little bit of molybdenum paste onto that ring, just enough to leave a dirty mark, outside edge and inside edge, and only on the bottom face. The bottom face has this pin sticking up. That pin goes down into the slot in this ring, and the pin couples with our diaphragm setting piece here. There's a fork in that pin must drop into. There are two notches in here that line up with the speed cam here. There's a tab on the speed cam here, and this little spring here, which is a detent, is the other position. I'm checking that all moves smoothly. This spring shows our diaphragm or our aperture settings at the top of the shutter. It's got a little notch in the bottom of it, which couples to a tab on that ring at that point. Get that seated in place. Why is that tight? That's all right. This piece, which is the lens, the lens mounts onto that, bayonets into the front of that. This is the detent here for the shutter speed settings. I'm just wiping that with a bit of molybdenum paste. Originally it was exceedingly well lubricated with graphite grease, which is not a terrible choice, but I would rather use the molybdenum because it's tidier. So I'll start that retaining ring and run that down into position. I'm using a wooden toothpick here. That certainly works well. Just be careful not to poke the end of the wooden toothpick through any of those little screw holes and snap the end off the toothpick, because the wooden piece in there will jam things up. Not immediately, only after you've sent the camera back to the other side of the planet. I'm just checking that for action to make sure, see if it's too stiff. The detent should be fairly positive, but the mechanism should not be too stiff. It feels okay. And we have one tiny little black screw, which was that one. And that goes in there to lock the retainer ring. These screws are not uncommonly lost. It's not uncommon to find a camera without the screw, and it just means that a previous, you didn't see any of that, did you? No. Here we go. I'm just putting that screw in there. The screws are very short. They're hard to get started. It's worth taking your time. There are no spares. If you make a mess of it If you double cross threaded or something, it's not going to go well. So the front lens, there's a tab on the front lens with a red dot on it. It's to be lined up with the red dot, which you can't see over here because it's looking a bit black at the moment, and then bayonet that into position. I'll see if I can clean that red dot out a bit so that it's more obvious. It's probably got a bit of dirt in it, or the paint may have gone. Yeah, no, that looks alright. So that's the front lens in position. The rear lens group just screws in at the back of the shutter. Just done up with the fingers. You don't need to put a spanner on it. There's no advantage in that. In fact, it's a great thing to do if you're looking for trouble. Now that's our shim that goes on the back, and of course our retaining ring. So now I've got this. Why does that not want to start? That's better. So I've got this shutter now, is all cleaned, ready, serviced, ready to go back on the camera.